Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 9th of February, where I wanted to talk about our next short story, A Rose for Emily. One of the reasons why I chose this particular short story is because the author gives some commentary about his thoughts about the story as we are going through the initial investigations of short story and learning how to read short story and write about short story. And one of the readings that I had assigned for you was about reading in the writing process in the edition of my text that's 1663 to 1678, which talks a little bit about the reading and the writing process that we've been talking about thus far. So I'll go over that as well with you. And also to draw your attention to the glossary of literary terms. We've been talking about a good number of literary terms, but again, I just wanted to draw your attention that you can find a glossary in the back of your textbook on pages 1716 to 1739 that talks about many of the terms that we've discussed or will be discussing. And what that means is after Rose for Emily, we're going to speed things up a little bit. You're going to have 3 short stories to read. And those 3 short stories are very different from one another, and that's very deliberate. One is entitled Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. You might be familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne if you are familiar with The Scarlet Letter. It talks a little bit about Puritan society in New England, especially within Massachusetts, Salem, Massachusetts to be exact. So that in and of itself makes it an interesting read because this is our geographic region. It explains a little bit of our history. It's an older text from the 1800s, so it probably will be a little bit more difficult to understand in terms of language. Then we'll get to Soldier's Home, and that's by Ernest Hemingway. And Ernest Hemingway is a more contemporary writer, and he tends to favor writing simply. But just because something is simple, it doesn't mean it's simplistic. We'll see a good amount of depth and complexity in this piece, where we have the story of a soldier who's coming home, which I suppose you can anticipate from the title, and the difficulties this soldier has reintegrating back into society. And then finally, a short story that's actually part of a larger novel entitled Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, which happens to be the science fiction story, but Invisible Man, which is a very important text about the African American experience. And luckily for us, the first chapter, Battle Royal, was initially published as an independent short story. So we can read that as an independent short story and understand it, though I will fill you in on the rest of the novel when we discuss it, just so that you can get a holistic sense of the story. In my opinion, it's perhaps one of the best novels ever written. This is quite high praise, so I'll talk a little bit about why I think so highly of it. But we're still at the beginning stages of reading and writing, so I wanted to draw your attention to page 1663 in our textbook, where it talks about annotating the text, in other words, writing notes in the text, and journal note-taking. And as you know, as we get closer to the end of our unit on short story, you will be having a journal due. And that is an informal response to 3 of the short stories in our short story unit. And that journal will be due once we're done reading all of the short stories, so that you can choose after having read and having us discuss them. But certainly you can choose earlier on and submit in that journal early if you so wanted to. The idea behind the journals is that you would do an informal response, approximately a page or so, for each of the 3 short stories that you select. So that would be a total of 3 pages. And I don't evaluate for grammar or mechanics. I evaluate for content. You could think of it as a kind of conversation on paper, a place where you can illustrate your thoughts, your reflections, your questions. And certainly you can talk about things that are discussed in the class videos. Certainly you can talk about elements from the discussion forum. And certainly you can talk about elements that might have occurred to you that we haven't had an opportunity to discuss. And it talks about the importance of when you are reading to take notes, whether you do so in the actual text itself or you do so in another venue. And basically, that's what your journals are, as far as I'm concerned, your note-taking. So they can be as informal as bullet points if you so wanted them to be. And I'll read you a section here. By writing down your reactions to characters, images, language, actions, and other matters in a reading journal, you can often determine why you like or dislike a particular work, or why you feel sympathetic or antagonistic to the author or a character, or discover paths into a work that might have eluded you if you hadn't preserved your impressions. The journal notes and the annotations may take whatever form you may find useful. Full sentences and grammatical correctness are not essential, unless they are to be handed in and your instructor requires that. And while you are handing it in, your instructor, me, I am not requiring that. Though they might allow you to make better sense of your own reflections days later. The point is simply to put in writing thoughts that you can retrieve when you need them for class discussion or for future writing assignments. And that section goes through and talks about how you can take a journal and actually transform it into an academic paper if you so want it. That's always my hope, that your journal writing will serve as a kind of springboard for more formal writing that you will be doing in the semester. That said, we haven't talked about formal academic writing yet, or writing a paper, but I just wanted you to know that that section was there, so that's something you could refer to. I'll also be covering the topic as well about how to write a paper when we get a little bit closer to the due date. You'll see they go through the steps from finding a topic, and I'm going to be supplying you with some sample paper topics, and you're free to choose any of those, but you can also create your own. So that's something that you can consider as you're writing. And then developing a thesis. That's a position upon which reasonable people could disagree. It's more than just stating a fact. It's making an argument and supporting that particular argument with evidence from the text. And that would be a combination of paraphrase, using your own language, as well as quotation, using exact language from the work, word for word. And there are ways to go about documenting a quotation that we will also be discussing, but I'm hopeful that this was something that you also reviewed in your English 101 classes. And then this idea about how to read a piece of literature. We talked a little bit about different questions that you could ask yourself. Did you want to ask yourself questions about the author? Did you want to ask yourself questions about the time period? Did you want to read the text from a psychological perspective or from a Marxist perspective? And again, not that you necessarily have to even view the text from a perspective. You remember that we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, that rather than letting the mode of interpretation influence how you read, then instead you should read and let the piece of literature help you decide how to read it. But for instance, if you were going to ask formalist questions, you would think about things like character point of view and setting and tone and diction and symbolism. If you were thinking about biographical questions, you would think about how the author's life might be relevant to understanding the work. But that's always tricky because authors are creating a piece of fiction, so there may not necessarily be a direct correlation. Psychological questions, you might ask yourself, how do the characters' emotions and behavior, how do those things reveal their psychological states? Historical questions, how does the work reflect the period in which it was written? Marxist questions. How does class differences, how are they presented in the work? Are the characters aware or unaware of the economic and social forces that influence their lives? And do economic conditions determine the characters' lives? Or new historicist questions. How are social values contemporary to the work reflected or related in the work? Or cultural studies questions. What does the work reveal about the cultural behavior of the time period? How does popular culture contemporary to the work reflect or challenge the values implicit or explicit within the work? Or gender studies questions. How are the lives of men and women portrayed in the work? Is the form and content of the work influenced by the author's gender? What attitudes are explicit or implicit concerning relationships? And does the work challenge or affirm your sense of relationship? Mythological questions. Are there archetypes or universal stories that are somehow presented? Things like quests or initiations or scapegoats. Does the protagonist or main character undergo any kind of transformation? Reader response questions. How do you respond to the work? How do your own experiences and expectations affect your reading? What is the work's original or intended audience? And to what extent are you similar to or different from that audience? And do you respond to the work in the same way after one reading? Or deconstructionist questions. How are contradictory and opposing meanings expressed in this work? How does meaning break down or deconstruct itself in the language of the text? And would you say that ultimate definitive meanings are impossible to determine and establish in the text? And if so, why? And then it talks about the organization of a paper, and that basically you want to write a paper in drafts and stages rather than do it all in one sitting at the last minute. Because when you write in stages, you let your subconscious basically work on the ideas. In fact, studies have shown that when you're learning new information, you have an increased REM or dream sleep. Once you've learned that information, you go back to regular REM or dream sleep. In other words, something is going on in your subconscious when you're learning something. Allow that process to happen. And when you are writing in draft stage, you don't necessarily have to worry about things like grammar or mechanics or even content. Just get down the ideas. And then you can revisit it the next day and then begin to organize the ideas. And then you can begin to polish the language. Or as a very wise professor of mine once said, a piece of writing is never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. So yes, you could continue to edit it and to improve it, but ultimately we don't have the luxury of years or months. Instead, we have weeks and days when we're in an academic semester. And that the introduction and the conclusion are particularly important because the introduction is where you're going to give your thesis, in other words, your position. So the reader should know after reading the introduction what your paper is going to be about. And you may not know when you begin writing, so you might actually discover your thesis as you are writing, and then you can plug it in after the fact, your introduction. So you don't have to go chronologically. And the conclusion is usually where people have said everything and they've run out of steam, so to speak. They're tired. You want to save a little bit of energy and for that conclusion so that it is as well developed as everything else that you've written. And it even talks about some of the criteria for how to quote, which again, I said I will revisit. And how to go about thinking about the paper. Is your topic manageable? Is your thesis clear? Is the paper logically organized? Is your argument persuasive? Should any material be deleted? Does the opening paragraph introduce the topic in an interesting way? Are the paragraphs developed? Are they unified? Are they coherent? Are there transitions linking the paragraphs and the different ideas together? Does the conclusion give a sense of closure? Is the topic and also the tone appropriate? Is the title engaging? And that means you have to have an original title, not just the title from the author. Are the sentences clear, concise, complete? Have you used technical terms correctly? Have you documented any outside sources? And I'm not going to be asking you to use outside sources, so that shouldn't necessarily be an issue, but you do have to document quotation from the text itself. And are you following your instructor's guidelines? Again, all of this is for the future, for when we begin talking about in depth about how to write a paper. But A Rose for Emily is a very interesting piece. One of the reasons why I assign this particular piece is because of the genre that it's written in. It's known as Southern Gothic. You might have heard that I teach a class in Gothic literature. And basically, Gothic literature is the foundation for things like horror fiction and horror film. And the Gothic tradition is all about setting. It's all about death and decay. Oftentimes it has supernatural elements associated with it, but not necessarily. There's usually a mystery that has to be solved. And This idea of the Gothic began in England, and some of the perhaps most famous horror texts are written in the Gothic tradition, such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all texts that I study in my Gothic literature class. But there were a group of authors who came to the United States, and you're probably familiar with one of them, who was writing in the United States, Edgar Allan Poe, and took the Gothic tradition. Edgar Allan Poe was born and raised in the United States, but he took the Gothic masters of the past and adapted that to the United States. And then it makes a certain level of sense that, Edgar Allan Poe would be from the Northeast because that was the first area of the United States that was settled. So that's basically our oldest area. The United States is fairly young compared to Europe, but certainly places like Massachusetts are much older than places like, let's say, California, or at least in terms of their being incorporated into the United States. And there were also a group of authors from the American South, and they began writing in a style called Southern Gothic. And that's what we see here in A Rose for Emily. It's got all of the Gothic traditions that we're used to from London, with the big castle and the creaking stairways and so forth. But it's set in the South, and it's a way to make commentary about some of the history of the South. And this author, William Faulkner, is very famously known for this short story, A Rose for Emily, that was written in 1931. And again, I said I was particularly interested in this short story because in 1959, years after the story was published, the author gave an interview talking a little bit about his thinking about constructing the text that I also wanted to talk about. Now, this text might be difficult to follow, and if it was for you, there's a deliberate reason for it. You may or may not have realized that the chronology is mixed. It's not in chronological order. This is done very deliberately to try to hide the ending from the reader. And actually, there are two endings that are hidden from the reader. There are two climaxes. So what I'm going to do is to tell you the plot of the story, but I'm going to put it in chronological order. Again, we aren't presented with this information in chronological order. But basically, we have Miss Emily, who is a Southern aristocrat. So she has a good amount of power, or her family has a good amount of power and money. And she had a very overbearing father who wouldn't allow her to date. And ultimately, he passed away. And she had a very difficult time accepting her father's death. In fact, so difficult that she refused to give up his corpse for 3 days. And then she basically becomes a recluse for a while, and she emerges. Now that she no longer has a father in her life, she can basically do as she pleases. So she begins to date, and the person that she decides to date raises many eyebrows because his name is Homer Barron, and he happens to be a laborer, so he's from a much lower social class than she is. And also, he happens to be a northerner, which is very different from the South. And at this point, we find out that after Emily's father has died, there really isn't much money left. Emily still has status in terms of her name, the Grierson family, but she doesn't have very much money. The town isn't quite sure how to deal with Miss Emily. She ultimately is a fixture in the town, and at least the old guard feels a certain level of respect and responsibility for her. So they concoct this story so they don't have to embarrass her about paying her taxes because she doesn't have the money to pay her taxes. So they create a lie and say that basically Emily's father, when he was alive, had loaned the town money, and now their way of paying it back is by excusing Emily from her taxes. Now, the old guard ends up ultimately just, dying and aging out. And the new politicians come into place. They want their tax money. And Emily says no, that she has an agreement with Colonel Sartoris, and they should speak with Colonel Sartoris. The difficulty is that Colonel Sartoris, by this point, has been dead for many years. At any rate, Emily is dating Homer, and there's lots of speculation about what's going on. And then at one point, Emily goes to the drugstore and buys arsenic. Now, you're supposed to tell the pharmacist why you're buying poison. She refuses to do so. The pharmacist is so intimidated by her, he sells her the arsenic anyway. And he says it's for rats. And then we find out that Homer goes to visit his girlfriend, Miss Emily, and then he's never seen again. And Miss Emily isn't seen for a very long time. After a short period of time, this terrible smell starts to come from her home. The townspeople, again, aren't quite sure how to confront her about this. They're intimidated by her. So they just spread some lime around her home in the middle of the night in order to mask the smell. And many, many years go by, and she becomes more and more reclusive. Again, refusing to pay her taxes, telling everyone to speak to Colonel Sartorius, even though Colonel Sartorius is already dead. And then finally, she herself dies. Actually, this is how our story begins at Miss Emily's funeral. And the whole town goes to her funeral, in part because they want to pay their respects, but in part because they're so curious about her as well, and especially because after the funeral, they get to go to her house, and which Emily has basically been a recluse in for many, many years at this point. So they do go to her home, and as they're investigating the house after the funeral, what they find is a locked room, and they're able to force their way in, and in the locked room, on a bed, they see the corpse of Homer Barron, her boyfriend. In other words, she killed Homer and she kept the body all of those years. That's climax number 1. And again, if you hadn't been able to keep track of the chronology, you may not have been able to find the clues to indicate that she had killed Homer. She bought arsenic. She has problems accepting death. Oh, I also forgot to mention that mental illness runs in her family. Another detail that'll be relevant. But then there's a second climax. So for people who were reading very carefully, they might have missed this. And the story ends that they find an iron gray hair in the pillow next to the corpse. Now, Miss Emily's hair has turned iron gray years after Homer disappears. So in other words, Miss Emily has been lying next to this corpse, because that's her hair, years after the corpse has decayed. And again, use your imagination, because anything your imagination can provide at this point would be much more horrific than any detail an author can give you, which is one of the first rules of Gothic literature or horror, which is to suggest, not necessarily to show, because that's usually much more horrifying. And that's the story, A Rose for Emily. It's very macabre. It's very graphic, obviously. And the story is usually read as a commentary about Southern culture living in a dead past, unable to accept that slavery has been eliminated. Emily's family has acquired its wealth and status through the labor of others, slavery. And while Emily has, quote, a servant now, unquote, that's only briefly mentioned in the story, obviously she doesn't have the money or the kind of power that she would have had when the institution of slavery was there. And Homer Barron, who is this newcomer from the North, is usually viewed as a representation of the New North taking over the Old South. The Old South as represented by Miss Emily, who's clinging to a dead past. And there are lots of quotations in the text that would seem to suggest that. There are other ways, certainly, to read the text, but this is the most common way to read the text. And if you think about the title, A Rose for Emily, one of the first things we probably are going to do is think about imagery for rose. That, yes, we usually think of a rose as a flower. And if you think about how a flower could perhaps be relevant for this story, Emily is much like a rose. She can be very delicate and fragile, much like a rose, but she also has thorns like a rose. She can hurt. Usually when we think of roses, we think of the color red. Though roses can be any color, really. And the idea of all of the associations with red, whether it be blood, which could be connected to the idea of murder, or whether it be passion, because Emily basically kills Homer because, and this is suggested, so it's not something that's directly stated, it's implied, that Homer doesn't want to commit to her, so this is her way of keeping him basically forever, in effect. We can also think about the occasion in which roses are given. Oftentimes they're given to show love. We're on the cusp of Valentine's Day, for instance. Oftentimes they're given at funerals, for instance, to show respect. And this idea of love and thwarted love and a funeral, which is how the story begins, beginning with a ceremony associated with death. All of that would be applicable. Roses are oftentimes kept as mementos. They're oftentimes dried out and they're kept as a sentimental souvenir. And if you can think about it, that's really what she does with Homer, is that she dries him out and keeps him as a kind of sentimental souvenir, as graphic and macabre as that is, but the macabre is oftentimes associated with Gothic literature. Rose also can be a color. It's a mixture of red and white. Perhaps we could think of red and white as the two extremes, and rose would be something in the middle. And perhaps this idea of Miss Emily evoking some empathy from us, but also she is villainous. She's a murderer. So we can't necessarily have complete empathy for her. So, she's a complicated character, much like the color rose could be complicated because it has a mixture of white, which could be purity, and red, which could be associated with evil. For instance, hellfire or the devil. Rose is also a verb. It's the past tense of to rise. Certainly it was the convention of Southern aristocracy at the time that whenever a female walked into the room of a particular status, the males would rise and show respect. These are the old ways that Miss Emily is still clinging to, as opposed to the new ways where people want their taxes paid and they want everybody to pull their weight, which is not what Emily is accustomed to. So that mixed chronology, as I indicated, which is going to lead to perhaps understanding plot. And I'm well aware now that some of you might be surprised by some of the plot, which is what I mean when I say that pieces of literature require rereading. That hides that double climax, the murder and also the iron gray hair. If we were also to put the plot in chronological order, this story sounds quite formulaic in that you have a repressed woman who basically begins dating, and because she can't achieve a certain level of commitment with her boyfriend, she decides to kill him. And the clues are there, from insanity in the family to her difficulty with accepting death to support her behavior. The smell coming from outside of the home after Homer disappears, her purchasing arsenic beforehand. All of these are clues that basically she's poisoned Homer. But again, if you mix the chronology, it's not so necessarily obvious, the cause and the effect. There is a good amount of foreshadowing in the story, and foreshadowing is oftentimes something that you don't appreciate until you know the story in its entirety so that you can go back and reread it. Foreshadowing being kinds of clues as to what might be occurring in the story in the future. Though you'll remember I had talked a little bit also about the idea of the glossary at the ending of the book. And if we were to look up foreshadowing, it'll give you a definition if you weren't sure. The introduction early in a story of verbal and dramatic hints that suggest what is to come later. So, we know there's insanity in the family. We know her father's domineering. We know that she denies death. 3 days with her father, the death of Colonel Sartoris, ultimately Homer's death. She buys arsenic, and in fact, when the druggist says it's for a rat poison, maybe we can even say that Homer is a rat because he refuses to commit to her. And I know that there's a line in the text that oftentimes raises eyebrows that individuals say, is it that Homer is homosexual or bisexual? And it's less that and more that he won't necessarily commit to her. And the line, I think, is also indicative of the way language would have been used at the time. And I'm well aware that there is some offensive language in this text, the N-word, for instance. I think it's important to understand the historical period that we're in. William Faulkner, his family came from Southern aristocracy, and in fact, he was quite embarrassed about that. So he oftentimes talked about in his writing the evil, for lack of a better word, because it truly was evil. The evil of slavery and what that has done to our society. But in terms of thinking about Homer and the idea of how he's presented, that he's told that basically he likes to go out and be with his friends. That he's not the kind of individual who's likely to commit to Emily or to commit to anybody else either. And that said, I'm trying to find the quote. I may not be able to find it now, but I can find it later, where it says that ultimately he's a kind of man's man, and that means that he prefers to be with his friends, not necessarily that he's having a sexual relationship with them. But it's really irrelevant, because all that really matters is that he is not going to commit to Miss Emily. And this is her response, that she will keep him in the way that she tries to keep to the dead past. So, that said, Homer's disappearance, the smell, and her reclusiveness, all of those are hints. I talked a little bit about the dead past of the Southern aristocracy, how Emily responds to death, the taxes, her quote, Negro, unquote, servant. It would be fascinating to get a story from him. He's silent throughout this, and he disappears as soon as she's gone. She refuses things like free postal delivery because that represents progress. She is writing in calligraphy because that represents the past. She's trying to teach China painting because that represents the past. And that said, one of the most important things about this piece is the narration. And I hope you notice that it's the community that narrates the story. We are given the story in the we. And the first line is, when Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. And then we are told the specifics of what happens. So while the story is, yes, indeed, about Miss Emily, and we're told again that Homer liked men, and again, I'm suggesting that that's not necessarily a sexual reference. The story is truly about the community and their treatment of Miss Emily. And remember that when she's buying arsenic, the speculation is that she's going to use it to kill herself. And rather than trying to intervene and help Miss Emily, the community just stands by to watch to see if that's going to happen. So the community is portrayed very negatively here. They are full of gossip. They're very self-serving. They're very self-centered. And they don't treat Miss Emily very well. Granted, she doesn't necessarily treat them very well either. But certainly there are hints and clues that she's not well, and no one intervenes really to try to help her, at least in not a serious way. They would have allowed her probably to commit suicide if that had been her intention. So think about how the community is portrayed in this particular story. Again, Faulkner's commentary on Southerners in general, not just the Southern aristocracy that Miss Emily represents. And that said, on A Rose for Emily, we have the author giving some of his perspectives. He's asked directly. And this is not included, unfortunately, for free on the web. This is part of our textbook. What is the meaning of the title, A Rose for Emily? And he says, this is Faulkner's answer. It's simply the poor woman had no life at all. Her father had kept her more or less locked up, and she had a lover who was about to quit her. And she had to murder him. It was just a rose for Emily, that's all. And yet I suggested, just a few minutes ago, all of these possible meanings for rose for Emily. And I'm not necessarily satisfied with Faulkner's answer. I don't know if it's because so much time has elapsed that he just doesn't remember the work. I don't know if it's because he just doesn't want to give us the answer because that's too easy. He wants us to work for it. I don't know if that's because that's truly what he thought. But even if that's what truly that he thought, that the title didn't have much significance at all, it doesn't matter what the author thinks from our perspective of literary analysis. As long as we can interpret the text and come up with evidence to support our viewpoints, then it's at least a valid interpretation from our perspective and from the perspective of literary analysis, even if the author disagrees. So that's one of the reasons why I gave this text. And he goes on, and he talks a little bit about, the interviewer says, this text has been read as a criticism of the North because of Homer's portrayal. Others have said it's a criticism of the South because of Miss Emily's portrayal. Now, could this story, shall we say, be more classified as a criticism of the times? The interviewer asks. And this is Faulkner's response. Now that I don't know, because I was simply trying to write about people. The writer uses environment, what he knows. And if there's a symbolism in which the lover represented the North and the woman who murdered him represented the South, I won't say that's not valid and not there. But it was no intention of the writer to say, let's see, I'm going to write a piece where I will use a symbolism for the North and another symbol for the South. And that he was simply writing about people. Notice how Faulkner's referring to himself in the third person, by the way. That he was simply writing about people, a story that he thought was tragic and true because it came out of the human heart, the human aspiration, the conflict of conscience and glands with the old Adam. It was a conflict not between North and South so much as between, you might say, God and Satan. I do remember reading this the first time and thinking to myself, I never thought of that interpretation, God and Satan. So I was quite relieved when the interviewer admitted that he himself had never thought of that interpretation. And the interviewer says, just one more thing. You say there's a conflict between God and Satan. I don't quite understand what you mean. Did one represent the? And this is Faulkner's answer. The conflict was in Miss Emily. She knew you do not murder people. She had been trained, you don't take a lover. You marry, you don't take a lover. She had broken all the laws of her tradition, her background. She'd finally broken the law of God, too, which says that you don't take a human life. She knew she was doing wrong, and that's why her own life was wrecked. And again, it's so English major-like to assume that one thing represents another. I don't know if Faulkner necessarily answered these questions. Certainly not to my satisfaction. I've had many students write papers on the significance of the title. I think they've done a much better job than Faulkner has in his just brief sentences about A Rose for Emily's title in their own writing and their 4 to 5 page paper. But I just use that as an illustration, since we're still talking about ways to interpret literature, that even the author can have a different interpretation. But as long as we can find evidence within the text, then we can support our position. And that's enough for it to be valid, or at least possible. It doesn't even have to be probable, just possible. So as I said, next class we're going to move a little bit more quickly now that we've gotten all of this foundation stuff about reading and writing about literature out of the way. 3 stories, all very different from one another. Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. I wouldn't be surprised if we started to fall behind a little bit, but you might have noticed that I have a catch-up class scheduled. So in the event that we do fall behind, we can't catch up. So what's left is our attendance question for today. That will be due 48 hours from now, so that would be Saturday at noon. That said, if you need an extension, please let me know. And as you know, with the attendance questions, you're not required to respond to your peers, though you certainly can, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses to the peers and to yourself. So that would simulate the kind of class discussion that we would have. And the question is for you to identify an important quote in A Rose for Emily and indicate why you think it's important. So I've given you some general themes and ideas about the text, but I haven't talked about quotation very much. So I'm going to leave that up to you to find an important quote in the text and then to talk about why you think it's important. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about additional short stories. Take care. Bye-bye.